Hey, welcome back to Fix It Friday. My name is George, and I'm here to talk about repairing and restoring retro video game systems. So this week's episode is going to be focused on the Virtual Boy. So for those of you that don't know, the Virtual Boy is widely considered Nintendo's greatest console failure. So this system was made in the mid-90s. There's less than 1 million of them out there. They were only released in Japan and in the United States. And in the United States, it was so bad that there's only 14 games that were ever made, and I happen to be crazy and own every single one of them. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be looking at modifying the Virtual Boy. So as it stands right now, the Virtual Boy is kind of an annoying system to work with. You have to kind of get in there and put your head in these visors, and it can be awkward. Some people actually get migraines from using this for extended periods of time. And frankly, the 3D effect isn't really necessary. You can totally play these games on, a modern television or, even a CRT. So thankfully nowadays there is an RGB mod. There's also a VGA mod that allow you to take the video output and the sound output from the Virtual Boy and then send it straight to a television, either using RGB or VGA. So on this week's episode, I'm going to show you how to modify a Virtual Boy so that you can do this and enjoy it a lot easier than, than doing this. Okay, so here are some of the tools that we're going to use. First off is we're going to need a soldering iron. We also need a game bit screwdriver and a Phillips to open up the case. We're going to need some ribbon cable for connecting everything up together. We also have some flush cutters and the 8-pin mini DIN. This is the RGB output, and there's also a circuit board associated with that. We've got a palette switch. We've got the mod board itself. We have some heat shrink wrap. We have a wire stripper, and then of course the Virtual Boy itself. Okay, so the first order of business is to disassemble the Virtual Boy. So we have to start with a game bit screwdriver, and we have a couple of screws to remove. You'll notice that there are 4 screws on the top, and those are actually just for that mounting plate, and so you actually can leave those alone, and it's totally fine. Okay, so the next thing that you have to do is just remove the bad lens. So there are 2 Phillips screws that you need to remove. And in this particular case, this is a Virtual Boy that I try to fix, and the lens in this case couldn't be totally repaired. It always had some dead lines on it. And this happens very rarely, but in that case, it's an ideal candidate for this particular mod. So in this next step here, what I'm doing is getting all of the wires ready so that they can be soldered to the board. And what you have to do is first strip off a little bit of the insulation on each end, and that's what you see me doing here. And I cut these out in advance. They're about, I think, 8 inches in length, more or less. And once all of those tips are exposed, then the next thing you need to do is tin them. And what I mean by that is that you need to bring some solder to each of the tips and coat them, and that makes connecting them to anything else significantly easier. So while I have a moment, I also want to just tell you a little bit more about the Virtual Tap mod. So in this particular example, I am doing a RGB video out, but this particular mod board can also be used with VGA. So depending on your retro setup, you may want to go with one option or the other. For example, if you have a FrameMeister or an OSSC or some kind of upscaler, then the RGB option is probably the best one for you. But if you don't have any of those things, then VGA is probably a better option because a lot of monitors will allow you to connect up the Virtual Boy directly as long as they have a VGA port. So the next step in this installation is to start installing all of those wires onto the Virtual Tap chip. And so there's a few things we got to do here. So I color code everything to make it a little simple. The first thing I install is the sync wire. That's the first one on the far right. And then after that, it's RG and B for red, green, and blue, and I color code that as well. Afterwards, there's a symbol called plus, and this is basically the voltage input onto the Virtual Tap board. And finally, there is ground, and then there's also a wire for the palette switch, and so you'll see me installing each one of those. In this particular case, I didn't use flux, but things are rather close, and so if you're having trouble keeping each one of those wires separately, using some flux will definitely help you. So the next step here is to drill some holes for the 8-pin mini DIN and for the pallet switch. So what I did was I used a 1/2 inch drill bit for the mini DIN, and I used a 1/4 inch for the pallet switch. And then once those holes are put together, you need to epoxy the 8-pin mini DIN, or at least in my case I did. So I just made a 2-part epoxy using some Gorilla Glue epoxy, and then with a Q-tip I just carefully went around the edges. You want to make sure you don't go anywhere near the pins and epoxy those, because then you're not going to be able to solder anything easily to them. You can also use things like hot glue, but I don't advise that. Okay, and so from here what I'm going to be doing is installing this little adapter board, and this is something I got from Tim Worthington in an NES RGB mod, and so I think that these are also commercially available. They're not necessary, but they just make the soldering a lot easier. And so what you see, I'm starting with the grounds, and then I'm going to systematically go to each one of those pins and solder them in place as well. It's also really important to do this once the glue has dried, because what I actually did at first was start a little too soon and things started moving, so you got to stop and make sure everything stays in place. Okay, so now that that's all finished, we're going to start connecting the wires that are on the other end of the virtual tap, and everything is conveniently labeled, so you just got to go one at a time and basically thread these wires through, add solder, clip off the excess, and call it a day. Something I didn't mention yet is that I put all of this stuff on the left-hand side of the case, and you'll find that that's a little bit easier. The right-hand side has the power/controller port and the link cable port and a few other things which just kind of make installation on the right a little bit more difficult. So since there really doesn't matter which side you use, I recommend going with the left just because of how easy it is to connect everything up. So we're getting kind of close to the end here, and what you see me doing in this step is actually adding audio to the 8-pin mini DIN. Now this is a completely optional step. The audio works just fine from the Virtual Boy, either using the internal speakers or the headphone jack, so you don't have to do any of this, but what I wanted to do with this particular one was have a nice convenient way of getting sound to the television. And so I took a look at the soundboard and I figured out that the 2 wires I needed from the speakers are red. So on the left and right side, they're both red. And so what you see me doing here is I desoldered the left speaker, and what I'm doing is basically connecting up an extension cable to that. So I just cut another piece of wire, and now I just put solder on both ends, and I'm holding everything carefully in place and connecting those 2 lines so that I have a nice stable connection. Now, once that's finished, I grab some heat shrink wrap and I cut off a little piece. And then I'm just going to thread that heat shrink wrap through and get it down to the place where I just made the new solder joint. And I'm going to use some heat from my iron to make the wrap shrink up so that the connection is snug and secure and doesn't make any contact with anything I don't want it to. So now, what you'll see me do next is solder it to the 8-pin mini DIN. And as you can see, I'm preparing another piece of heat shrink wrap for that, because again, I don't want these pins to touch anything. So I thread it through. And the way that I have the mini DIN oriented, the left side corresponds to the left channel, the right side corresponds to the right channel. So just like before, I'm going to bring everything close together. I'm going to add some heat, add some solder, get everything connected up, and then with my heat shrink wrap, I'm going to secure the connection for good. So one thing that I want to mention before I forget is that you should be mindful of where you purchase your SCART cables for this particular mod. So it has to do with the power that the virtual tap needs. It doesn't actually take 5 volts, it takes something much lower, and it's coming from pin 16 on the SCART connector. So the ones that I purchased here are from retrogamingcables.co.uk, and they're the Pack-a-Punch for NES RGB. And those provide the correct voltage on the correct pin. Others may not. I can guarantee that those work, but again, just do your homework before you purchase SCART cables for this particular mod. Okay, so here what you'll see is that I have now the wire from the right speaker, and what I did in this case was I just desoldered it from the speaker on the right hand side, and then I snipped it away because it's attached to the ground, and cut enough so that I could get it separated. And then just like beforehand, I am connecting the 8-pin mini DIN to the wire, and you can see me here just double checking my connection. And as long as everything's looking good, then I'm bringing the iron in and I'm heating up the heat shrink wrap so that it shrinks up and gives you a nice secure protection of that particular joint. Okay, so for the last real major step, we are going to be setting up the palette switch. Now in this case, I had purchased an SPST, that stands for single pull, single throw switch. You can get these all over the place, like DigiKey, Mouser, I mean, Amazon, you name it. And it basically has three soldering points, and basically you need to create ground or the palette in the center, and then ground on the opposite side, so that when the switch is pushed, there's a short between the ground and the palette. And so what you see me doing here right now is just tinning the two places, and then connecting up here. I'm connecting palette to the center, and now I've created a little short wire for ground, and I'm going to be putting ground on one side. So I'm soldering it to one side of the switch, and then the other side is going to go to the ground on the 8-pin mini DIN. And with that, all of our connections are complete, and it's time to start closing up the case, testing everything out. Usually I don't button everything up completely because you never know if you make a mistake, and it's usually better to just close it up enough to test and then see if things are good, and if they are, then go ahead and close it up for good. Okay, so here's the final test, and you can see I have the Virtual Boy plugged in, and then I have the RGB cable going all the way to my open source scan converter in the back. So now we're just gonna go ahead and flip the switch and see what happens. Okay. Of course I picked Jack Brothers, which is the most expensive and actually really awesome game in the Virtual Boy library for North America. And you can see the audio is coming from the television, not from the Virtual Boy, which is what I wanted. And if I flip the palette switch, we get different colors. So thanks again for watching, and stay tuned for the next episode.